Welcome to this week's Training on Demand. We're talking about interoperability. You know, it's a big word. We've talked about it before. We've talked about it on a roundtable discussion. But you know what? I think it bears mention. So when you're going to get into one of these discussions, you probably need to figure out what it is we're really talking about. I use the graphic of the puzzle pieces, right? Interoperability allows all of the pieces to fit together. It's diverse groups and systems. You see, it's more, you got groups and you have systems, and it's more about than just what we think it is. And what we talk about all the time is this. We get involved in the discussion about radios, interoperable radios. We all have to be able to talk to one another all the time. I get it. I've been around long enough to understand it. I understand that the problems that were discovered at 9/11 and before, police and fire, and nobody knew, and people can't talk, and all of those things that go with it. But I guess I would ask you, before we decided if everybody could talk to anybody, the question here on the slide is, at your last multiple alarm emergency, when did you wish that there were more people on your radio frequency? And I'm being facetious there, obviously, but I think that is something that we need to think about. I truly believe there's another way to manage interoperability, and it could be, it is, in my opinion, whatever that's worth these days, but in my opinion, I think it's better. And I think that when you start talking about interoperability, it has to be synonymous with unified command. Who are we trying to be interoperable with? Well, there's obviously mutual aid fire departments, EMS agencies, whatever. Intra-community. Maybe it's DPW locally. Maybe it's, listen, we have active school shooter training. Maybe it's our school departments. Maybe it's the police, all of that sort of stuff. Law enforcement, we've listed there. State agencies, emergency management agencies, other local governments that are next to us, community organizations, people, Red Cross, CERT teams. That's a big deal, right? So where do they fit in? How do we operate when we're talking about systems and groups of people? There are a lot of groups of people that we might have to deal with in the time of an emergency. Does interoperability take place long before the emergency? And I'm of the belief that it certainly does. I think when we start talking about planning, I think when you talk about LEPCs, local emergency planning commissions, regional REPCs, emergency planning commissions, all of these things, I think that the issues of interoperability, I think the non-emergency is a couple of fold, and one of the greatest ones, and folks know me, is, training. I think you can do a lot of stuff training prior to an emergency, and you can still be interoperable to some degree in that fashion. It's not only the emergency scene that we're talking about. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to unify here? And I think that this is something that I think forms a triangle and can be used in a lot of things. It's the people, it's the procedures, and it's the equipment that we use that all has to come into play here. But I truly, truly believe that some of the answers here rely on a strong, unified command system. I think that once we do that and do it well and do it effectively, I think that we've really got some opportunities to solve some of the interoperable problems that occur on emergency scenes. The less resources you have, the more likely you are to interact with others. It's just common sense. Big agencies, FDNY doesn't have to call a whole lot of mutual aids. Now, they may have companies that don't normally operate together, the larger the incident you get. But, large agencies don't rely on mutual aid. Coming from some small suburban departments, we rely on mutual aid for just about every working fire. When you start talking about agencies that are responding with 8, 9, 10, 13 people on a first alarm, that's not a first alarm. The fact is that smaller organizations may have to pay greater attention to these interoperable conditions. I think small agencies interact well within their own community. The fire chief knows the DPW director, the fire chief knows the police chief. Smaller organizations need it more, and in some cases, quite frankly, they probably do it as well or better than others. So think about interoperability in a couple of different ways. Again, I think that this is kind of just a broad brush, just to give you something to think about. But I think you need to pay attention to it. Hey, if you've got any questions or you need to leave feedback on this particular section, send an email back to pete@peteliam.com. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And we're certainly going to talk more about the interoperability stuff in a later session of one of our training on demand.